In the Gilded Age Season 3, Episode 4, Gladys Russell becomes the Duchess of Buckingham. But even before the vows are exchanged, the audience can sense something is wrong. Her expression isn't one of a happy bride. It's sorrow, confusion, maybe even fear. Her eyes are wet not from joy, but from grief. And what makes this scene so powerful is that Julian Fellowes didn't invent it. He borrowed it from the very pages of history pages written by Consuelo Vanderbilt, the real woman whose story mirrors Gladys' fate almost exactly. Consuelo was only 19 when her mother, Alva Vanderbilt, pushed her into marrying Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. And she didn't just push gently, she manipulated, threatened, and isolated her own daughter until she had no choice but to say yes. Sounds familiar, right? In the Gilded Age, Bertha Russell behaves in the exact same way. She denies Gladys the love of her life, Billy Carlton, because he doesn't come with a title. And when Gladys resists, Bertha uses every ounce of her power as a mother and a social climber to shut down any other path. What's chilling is how history repeats itself in this fictional world. Because Consuelo, too, loved someone else, a handsome young American man named Winthrop Rutherford. But Alva didn't care. Just like Bertha, Alva wanted a duke, and she got one. The Duke of Marlborough wasn't looking for love. He was looking for money. He needed a wealthy American bride to save his ancestral estate Blenheim Palace. And Alva wanted her daughter to be the first American duchess, so they struck a deal. He gave up the woman he loved. Consuelo gave up the man she adored, and Alva gave him millions. That's not a love story, it's a business transaction written in tears. But let's go back to the wedding. In the Gilded Age, the wedding seems grand, even magical, but the pain on Gladys's face tells the real story. And Consuelo described her own wedding day the same way. She wrote in her memoir the glitter and the gold that she spent that morning alone, sobbing. Her mother locked her in a room. A footman stood guard outside so she couldn't escape. Her own governess wasn't allowed in. No visitors. No comfort, just isolation and fear. She said her heart was broken, and still, she was made to dress up in lace and silk, to smile through the agony, and to walk into a church that felt more like a prison. Even the wedding itself was delayed for 20 minutes because Consuelo had cried so much, her face had to be repaired before she could appear. And yet, from the outside, it was called a fairyland. The flowers, the gowns, the guest sit was a perfect event. But the bride was trapped. The Gilded Age captures this haunting contradiction perfectly. The opulence of the ceremony hides the heartbreak. And the deeper you look, the more you see how tragic this moment really is. Gladys Russell becomes a duchess, but in doing so, she loses everything else. Her love, her freedom, her voice, and history tells us exactly where this path leads. Asterisk, to truly understand Gladys' forced marriage, we have to look beyond the wedding and into the mind of the woman pulling the strings, Bertha Russell, cold, calculating, and obsessed with social dominance. Bertha doesn't just want her daughter to be happy, she wants her to be powerful. And that's where the line between fiction and fact becomes dangerously thin. Because Bertha Russell is not just a character, she's based on Alva Vanderbilt, a woman who viewed her daughter's future not as a matter of love or happiness, but as a weapon in her war against the old money elite of New York society. Alva herself was once shut out of the upper circles, born in the South and dismissed as a social outsider. She married into the Vanderbilt empire but wasn't welcomed by the Astors or other legacy families. She was too ambitious, too loud, too new. So when her daughter Consuelo came of age, Alva made a brutal decision. If she couldn't win the fight for social acceptance herself, she would do it through her child. She would place her daughter on a throne and sacrifice everything else to do it. Just like Bertha in the Gilded Age, Alva didn't accept that her daughter might want to marry for love. She viewed love as weak, childish. What mattered was power, rank, glory. She planned the Duke's proposal like a military campaign. She took Consuelo to Europe and paraded her in front of eligible royals like a trophy. She even went so far as to deceive her, telling her that her true love, Winthrop Rutherford, had abandoned her. Consuelo didn't know the truth until it was far too late. It's a pattern we see repeated in the Gilded Age. Bertha lies, she manipulates. She isolates Gladys from her friends, ignores her pleas, and pushes her forward like a pawn in a high-stakes game. And when Gladys finally breaks, it's not seen as pain. It's seen as victory, a mother's win over her daughter's will. But here's the devastating irony. Alva Vanderbilt may have succeeded in getting her daughter married off to a duke, but the cost was unbearable. The marriage was loveless from the beginning. Charles Spencer Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough, made it clear he had married for money. He had a lover in England, and he left her for Consuelo only to restore the crumbling walls of Blenheim Palace. That's what $100,000 a year could buy in 1895, roughly $3.2 million today. And he got even more than that. Alva gave him $2.5 million. In railroad stock worth over $80 million today. It was the price of a title. And for Consuelo, it was the end of freedom. Gladys' story in the Gilded Age follows this same cold blueprint. Her tears are not seen as resistance, they're part of the deal. And Bertha, like Alva, justifies it all by saying it's for her daughter's good. But what kind of good begins with heartbreak? Julian Fellowes knows this truth. That's why the show doesn't hide Gladys' sadness. Instead, it lingers on it. It forces the audience to feel the weight of this betrayal. A mother is supposed to protect her daughter, not imprison her, not sell her. Consuelo Vanderbilt never forgave her mother completely, and who could after her marriage? She wrote in her memoir how English high society treated her with disdain. She was a dollar princess and outsider with cash, but no breeding. They mocked her accent, her manners, even her clothing. She was expected to conform, to vanish into the background of English nobility. And she did, for a time. She played her part, she bore children, she kept up appearances, but inside she was empty. Gladys too now faces this slow erasure. Across the Atlantic in a palace far from home. She must now play the Duchess, smiling, nodding, obeying. But the woman she wanted to be, the life she dreamed of with Billy Carlton, is gone. Replaced by titles, money, and expectations. In the show, we're only beginning to see the cracks. But history tells us how deep they run. The marriage was a cage. And eventually, something had to break. It was never about love. Not for the Duke, not for Alva, and certainly not for Bertha Russell. For them, this marriage was a transaction, one that brought prestige to their name and survival to a dying estate. In the Gilded Age, Gladys Russell becomes the shining jewel in a deal that stretches across continents. Her feelings ignored, her desires crushed. And in real life, Consuelo Vanderbilt was treated no differently. Her new husband, the Duke of Marlborough, needed one thing. His title was grand, his lineage noble, but his estate, Blenheim Palace, was on the brink of financial ruin. And while English aristocrats still held social power, they had very little left in terms of cash. Marrying a wealthy American heiress was a solution that many noblemen pursued in the late 19th century. Consuelo, like Gladys, was young, beautiful, and rich, and, therefore, she became his answer. What's devastating is how aware she was of this arrangement. In her memoir, The Glitter and the Gold, she recalls the shallow conversations, the emotionless proposals, the hunger in their eyes not for her heart, but for her dowry. The men who approached her didn't hide it. They were aristocrats drowning, in debt, desperate to restore their family names, and she, unfortunately, was their ticket. Gladys walks the same path. Her wedding may look like a fairy tale, but underneath the glamour lies betrayal. Even her new husband, the Duke of Buckingham, seems more like a business partner than a romantic match. The truth is, he didn't fall for her. He fell for what she represented, a way to keep his family afloat. A marriage like this doesn't need love. It just needs signatures. And gold. Back in 1895, when Consuelo married the Duke of Marlborough, the world watched with envy and fascination. Newspapers praised the wedding. Society women gossiped about the dress, the flowers, the guest list. But Consuelo later revealed that it was one of the loneliest moments of her life. And perhaps that's the most haunting part of all, how pain can be so easily dressed up in lace and diamonds, how a woman's heartbreak can be hidden beneath a veil. In the Gilded Age, Julian Fellowes recreates this exact tragedy. He lets us see what no one saw in Consuelo's time. The tears, the hesitation, the look in Gladys's eyes that says, "This isn't what I wanted." And when you strip away the elegance, the carriages, the titles, what's left? A young woman forced into a life that's not her own. A mother who saw her child's future as currency, a groom who saw his bride as a solution, and a society that cheered, never once asking how she felt. That's the cruel pattern. These marriages were never meant to build happiness. They were built to maintain power. American money propped up crumbling British titles, and in return, American families got something far more valuable than respect. They got access. They got entry into the world's oldest elite, but the price was high. It cost daughters their joy, their voices, their freedom. Gladys Russell now begins that same journey. She sailed away from New York, away from everything familiar, into a world that looks beautiful but feels like a trap. The show hints at what's coming: trouble with Hector's sister, the coldness of British customs, and possibly even a shift in Bertha and George's relationship. Because even though Bertha believes she's won by securing this alliance, history shows us that these victories rarely last. Consuelo's marriage fell apart just 11 years later, and not quietly. Her sadness was so deep, so visible, that it couldn't be hidden behind etiquette. They separated in 1906 after years of emotional distance. But even then, they couldn't legally divorce. The law in England was cruelly lopsided. A man could divorce a woman by proving she was unfaithful. But for a woman, that wasn't enough. She had to prove cruelty, physical cruelty. Imagine that. You can be emotionally abandoned, publicly humiliated, and still not be allowed to leave. Consuelo endured this limbo until the law finally changed. In 1920, 25 years after her wedding, she was granted a divorce. Only then was she free. Free to live, free to love. But her youth was already gone, and so much had been lost. And here's a bitter twist that makes the Gilded Age connection even more piercing. Just 1 year after divorcing Consuelo, the Duke married someone else. Her name, Gladys, a different woman, but the same name as the character whose life he inspired. It's a detail almost too ironic to believe. The real Duke who married Consuelo for money ended up marrying a woman named Gladys after everything fell apart. Life, history, and fiction twist together in this story in ways that feel like fate. But the pain was real. And the Gilded Age dares to show it, not just the glamour of old New York and British aristocracy, but the scars left behind by choices women never wanted to make. The glitter hides the truth, and the gold. It was never worth the price. Asterisk, after the flowers have wilted and the guests have gone, what happens to a woman who's been given everything but the freedom to choose? In the Gilded Age, we've seen the build-up to Gladys Russell's grand marriage celebration masked in heartbreak, a victory that feels like defeat. But the real tragedy begins after the wedding. Because this isn't a happy ending. It's the start of a slow unraveling, behind palace walls where expectations suffocate, and love has no voice. If we follow the historical path that inspired this story, then Gladys, like Consuelo Vanderbilt, will soon learn that titles and wealth are not a shield from sorrow. Once married and shipped across the Atlantic, Consuelo entered a world that was colder, stricter, and lonelier than she ever imagined. English aristocratic life was not a romantic fantasy. It was rigid, full of meaningless protocol, and built on the constant pressure to perform a role. There was no warmth, there was no escape. And Consuelo, like Gladys, had to endure it with grace because anything else would be scandalous. She gave birth to children. She attended public events. She smiled, but inside, she was fading. And the most painful part, everyone around her acted like this was normal. That her sadness was just part of the duty she was born into. In the Gilded Age, we've seen glimmers of this pressure already. Even before the wedding, Gladys is being molded not into the woman she is, but into the version her mother demands. And now that she's crossed the ocean, she's expected to become something even more foreign, the perfect duchess. Yet beneath the lace and titles, she is still just a girl who wanted to marry for love. Billy Carlton was her dream, her hope. But Bertha destroyed that dream, insisting it wasn't enough. And now Gladys belongs to a man who didn't choose her out of affection, but necessity. A man who needs her money more than her heart. Just like the Duke of Marlborough needed Consuelo. And what makes this story so haunting is that it mirrors so many real women's lives in that era, trapped in golden cages, celebrated in newspapers, but isolated in their own homes. Consuelo wrote about how the English upper class treated her as an outsider. She was American, and to them, that meant vulgar, uncultured, secret. They accepted her wealth, yes, but not her spirit. And when she tried to assert herself, to push back, she was met with cold resistance. Snobbery, she said, was embedded in their bones. It wasn't just rude, it was institutional. And when Gladys now enters that same world, the Gilded Age suggests that history may repeat again. The show hints that not everything will go smoothly. There are tensions already brewing with Hector's sister, and Bertha's victory may not be as secure as she thinks. Because when you force a daughter into a life she didn't choose, you don't just break her heart. You plant the seeds of rebellion. Let's not forget that Consuelo eventually fought back. After years of misery, she separated from the Duke in 1906, a shocking decision at the time. Divorce was not acceptable for women, especially not for duchesses. But Consuelo reached a breaking point. And when the law changed in 1920, she divorced him officially and publicly, and she did so on her own terms. She proved that he had abandoned her, that he was unfaithful, that the marriage was and always had been a lie. And then, finally, she lived. 1 year later, she married a Frenchman named Jacques Balsan, and this time it was for love. They stayed together until his death in 1956, decades of true partnership that proved she had not been destroyed, only delayed. The Gilded Age hasn't reached this part of Gladys' story yet, but if it continues to mirror history, then heartbreak may lead to healing. Because even though Consuelo was forced into a life she didn't choose, she chose her ending. She reclaimed her story, and Gladys might do the same. The show teases this possibility. Julian Fellowes has built strong women before characters who fall, then rise stronger. But the pain comes first. The betrayal, the loneliness, the silence of palace halls where no one asks if the bride is happy, only if the legacy is intact. Bertha may believe she's secured her family's future, but what has she truly done? She's silenced her daughter, traded love for legacy, and it's only a matter of time before that cost comes crashing back. Because in both fiction and history, the daughters of ambitious mothers eventually stop obeying. They remember who they were before the titles, before the ceremonies. They remember who they loved. And sometimes, when the time is right, they fight back. The wedding is over, the carriage has rolled away, and Gladys Russell has disappeared into a world that was never truly hers. What remains is not just a duchess with a glittering title, it's a girl whose life was rewritten by someone else's ambition. In The Gilded Age Season 3, this moment may look like a grand triumph for Bertha Russell, but beneath the surface, it is the start of a quiet tragedy. And if Julian Fellowes continues to draw from the real story of Consuelo Vanderbilt, then the most heartbreaking chapters of Gladys's life are still to come. The tears at the altar were not a one-time breakdown, they were a warning. A glimpse of the emotional cost that comes with marrying into a legacy you never chose. Gladys may have the crown, but she has lost her voice. And that silence, history, shows us, does not last forever. Because just like Consuelo, she is not weak, she is not defeated. She is simply surviving. For now, Consuelo spent over a decade living as the Duchess of Marlborough, walking the endless halls of Blenheim Palace, fulfilling her duties, raising children, and bearing the cold distance of a husband who never saw her as an equal. And yet she endured, she studied, she traveled, she built alliances of her own. She used the very position that had once imprisoned her to later fight for change. After her divorce, she didn't vanish. She became an advocate for women's rights. She supported charitable causes. She used her fame not for vanity, but for purpose. And in the end, she wrote Her Truth, the Glitter, and the Golda, memoir that peeled back the mask of aristocratic glamour and revealed what it truly felt like to be sold for status. It was her rebellion, her revenge, and her redemption. And maybe that is what lies ahead for Gladys Russell too. Because The Gilded Age is not just a show about opulence. It's about the cost of that opulence. It's about women fighting against systems designed to silence them. And if Gladys follows in Consuelo's footsteps, her silence will not last. Not forever. There are hints already, small fractures in Bertha's perfect world. Her control over George's slipping, cracks in their marriage, though subtle, are beginning to widen. And what happens when Gladys refuses to play the perfect duchess? What happens when she writes her own letter, tells her own story? History says it won't be quiet, it won't be polite, and it won't serve the ambitions of a mother who built her empire on her daughter's sorrow. Because for all of Bertha's success, for all the social climbing, all the scheming, all the dazzling victories, it may all come crashing down the moment Gladys decides she's had enough. The moment she dares to speak, to resist, to demand her life back. And The Gilded Age thrives in these moments, when the women who are told to obey choose rebellion instead. That is the fire burning beneath this storyline. Not just the sadness of a forced marriage, but the promise of what happens next. And then there's the eerie historical twist we cannot ignore. 1 year after Consuelo's divorce, the Duke married another woman, her name Gladys. It's a strange, cruel echo, a name passed from pain to irony. But in The Gilded Age, that twist takes on a new meaning. Because this Gladys isn't going to vanish. She's not going to fade into the background, whether it takes one season or several. The story Julian Fellowes is telling feels like it's building toward something bigger than betrayal. It's building toward justice, toward a reckoning, and maybe even toward freedom. So, If you watched episode 4 and felt uneasy when Gladys stepped into that carriage, if you saw her tears and wondered whether they meant something more, you were right. That wasn't just a sad bride. That was history repeating itself. And now, as the Gilded Age continues, we'll be watching not just for drama and decadence, but for a girl who was once silent, learning how to roar. Because behind every diamond, Tiara is a story of survival, and Gladys Russell's story has only just begun.